The C to the I to the A's, declassified documents pertaining to the Gateway experience. Today is part 2. We're going to be talking about hypnosis. All right, this is a very interesting topic, and they actually went really deep on it. And I've got a couple diagrams to kind of supplement this as well. And we'll talk about the diagrams as we go through this. Remember, I want this to be something where you get an explanation and it's not just a reading. Okay. So let's just get right into the declassified documents on hypnosis. According to the theories of psychologist Ronald Stone and the biomedical engineering models of Ishtok Bentov, hypnosis is basically a technique which permits acquisition of direct access to the sensory motor cortex in the pleasure centers and lower cerebral portions or emotional portions and associated pleasure centers of the right side of the human brain following successful disengagement of the stimulus screening function of the left hemisphere of the brain. Okay, so that's a lot of words. Let's just break it down right here at the beginning because it might be just a bunch of difficult technical knowledge needed. Here's what I'm going to tell you. Throughout this, what they're talking about with hypnosis is they're talking about the subconscious mind and the conscious mind. But what they're doing is they're calling it the left and right hemisphere of the brain. This is what my conclusion is after reading this many, many times. So this is the diagram that they gave us, but I actually found some diagrams that I feel like will help more. But here's the concept I want you to roll with for the beginning here is that when they're talking about there's different portions of the brain and different centers, it might not be exact with the left and right hemispheres, but the concept of there's a screening function and then there's a just taking information function is very apparent, and we'll talk about that more. So that's actually the next part of this. So they're talking about the left hemisphere of the brain. All right. They say that it is the self-cognitive, verbal, and linear reasoning component of the mind. Does that remind you of the conscious mind? All right. This is kind of a crappy diagram. But as you can see here, the conscious mind, as many of us know who have studied, like I've studied the work of Dr. Joe Dispenza and Bruce Lipton. And Joseph Murphy as well. And they very much went into this concept that there's a conscious mind and a subconscious mind. And the conscious mind is this analyzation. It's these thinking patterns, not necessarily the deep thinking patterns, but it's the conscious thought, which means thought that you can direct. And then there's thought that you aren't directing consciously. And that would be the subconscious mind. So I want you to start to take in the analogy here that the left is more of the, as they call it, the left hemisphere of the brain is a self-cognitive, verbal, and linear reasoning component. So the reasoning portion of your brain, according to them, is the left. All right, and then it fulfills the function of screening incoming stimuli. Get that? All right. By categorizing, assessing, and assigning meaning prior to allowing passage to the right hemisphere of the mind. Exactly what many people say the subconscious and conscious is these days. All right. And then the right hemisphere, which we can say, or at least theorize, that this is a direct correlation to the subconscious mind, which functions as the non-critical, holistic, nonverbal, and pattern-oriented component of the brain, which appears to accept what the left hemisphere passes to it without question. Consequently, if the left hemisphere can be distracted either by boredom or through reduction to a soporific semi-sleep state, external stimuli to include hypnotic suggestions are allowed to pass unchallenged into the right hemisphere where they are accepted and acted upon directly. Does that remind you of anything? If you've studied Dr. Joe's work, which he's very popular in the spiritual/scientific community, reminds you of not only his work, but many others' work where they talk about how there's brainwave states. And I talk about this in my book, 10 Secrets of Awakening, which at this moment, when you're watching this video, it'll be out within a couple weeks. All right. And what we're getting at with this is that as you go into lower brainwave states, what happens? You get access to different parts of your brain. So they're saying through boredom or through, what do they call it? A semi-sleep state, What's a brainwave state that's known to be a semi-sleep state? Right here, subconscious mind usually is described as in this chart, usually light sleep. All right. Deep meditation as well, intuition, memory, and vivid visual imagery. And we'll get to the imagery when we talk about biofeedback on the fourth part. Okay. So putting it in today's language, because this is from 1983, it's more well known that this is really the subconscious mind and not the right hemisphere of the brain, but it could be either one. I'm not saying that it is one and it isn't the other. All right, let me figure out where I am. I wish I could highlight what I'm talking about on these, but I can just do this, but I can't actually highlight it, so I just got to find where I was at. Okay, so mm, all right, the result may involve an emotional reaction originating in the lower cerebral region, sensory motor responses requiring involvement of the cortex, and so on. And we'll talk about what that means in a sec. So stick with me. Both the sensory and the motor cortices of the right cerebral portion of the brain contain a sequence of points known as a homunculus, which corresponds to points in the body. See Exhibit 1, next page. So we're going to look at that right now before we continue on. So this is their diagram. As you can see, it is it's not the easiest to understand, but I actually found someone who took this because it looks okay, right? It looks like a 1983 drawing. Whoever drew this was very intellectually capable to have this. I'm not saying it's good. It's not good. But I found a better version online, or a more detailed version, which you can see, which is right here. Okay, so there's this thing in your brain called a homunculus. Now, they're saying in the document that the homunculus is just one hemisphere of your brain, but from my understanding and from this chart, it's actually there's a somata sensory cortex and a motor cortex. And from what this looks like, right, doesn't it seem as though it's on both sides? So what I would ask you to contemplate is that it's the conscious and subconscious mind, and then when the conscious mind tells the subconscious mind to do something, it does it. If it can get past, if you can suggest something without the analyzation part of the conscious mind, if that makes sense. So when we're talking about the homunculus, you can see that there's different parts of your brain when you activate it. It, it activates certain things within your body. So it looks very technical to understand, but it isn't really that difficult to understand. Okay. So all the different points, as we can see down here, are like you can see your lips are at a certain part of your brain, and then you've got your elbow, which is a different part of your brain. So electrically, this is just really interesting to think about. That electrically, you're sending signals to your brain and it activates certain things in your body. I mean, think about the ridiculous complexity that that takes. Okay. So stimulation. Back to the document. Stimulation of the corresponding area on the cortex causes intermediate response in the associated portion of the body, which is exactly what we just talked about. Consequently, induction of the suggestion that the left leg is numb, if it reaches the right hemisphere unchallenged, is referred to the appropriate area of the sensory cortex, will result in an electrical reaction being generated that will induce a feeling of numbness. So if you can get the signal through that your left leg is numb to your brain without your analyzation feature being activated of the conscious mind being like that, basically think about the part of you that says, or the part of your brain that says no when you think of something. The simple way to do this would be like, I'm feeling, it's literally numbness is a perfect example. I'm feeling like there's a numbness in my calf right now, and your mind's like, no, it's not. But if you were to able to overcome that, transcend that, you could actually make your leg numb just through the electrical signals in your brain. That's essentially what they're getting at. And through hypnosis, through lowering the brainwave states, which is essentially what we can understand this is about, because that's what puts you in a semi-sleep state, is your brainwave state, that you can do things. And this also has implications on your external reality beyond your body. Now, that's my opinion, and we'll talk about, there are parts in the document that also talk about these things. All right. So if the induction of suggestion is, if it reaches the right hemisphere unchallenged, that's the important part, is referred to the appropriate area of the sensory cortex, which will result in an electrical reaction being generated that will induce feeling of numbness. Similarly, the suggestion that the person is experiencing a general feeling of happiness and well being would be referred to the appropriate pleasure centers located in the lower cerebral portion or in the cortex of the right hemisphere, thereby inducing a suggested feeling of euphoria. Just take that in. Finally, finally, suggestions as one that informs the hypnotic subject that he enjoys enhanced concentration or powers of memory would be responded to in the right hemisphere by accessing unused information storage capacity, normally held in reserve as a result of the left hemisphere selection and control processes. So, this is suggesting kind of a wild notion that may be very unfamiliar to some, that your brain has much more storage than you can imagine right now, but your conscious mind, by your beliefs and thinking patterns, is stopping you from accessing it. And if we look here, if you are hypnotically suggested and it goes right to the right hemisphere, that you can access unused information storage capacity, normally held in reserve, as a result of the left hemisphere selection and control processes, then you can. As it says, this aspect will become significant in the context of the gateway process when attention is given to examining the way that hypnosis may be used to accelerate progress in the early stages of the gateway experience. So remember, we're analyzing this. We're analyzing this because this is a major key to understanding the entire document, which again, we will be doing and we are doing. And my aim is to get a video out a day until I finish this, or pretty close to every day. So you can expect these to be coming. But I wanted to put them in a smaller format so that it made more sense and we didn't have to rush through it. The way we can understand it. And there are other things that I'm going to bring in for hypnosis. Like, I've studied, if you've watched or listened to the Universe Again podcast, if you go back to the first episode, it's all about Dr. Michael Newton. And Dr. Michael Newton was the author of Journey of Souls, where he did hypnotic regression into the spirit world. And I feel like this is correlated to hypnosis, obviously, if it's hypnotic regression, but we don't have enough understanding to get into his work yet because we haven't talked about the extra dimensional things beyond time space, that which is what we will be talking about eventually. And a lot of you may, if you've also been watching, know me for the videos, the short form videos I did that were based on Dewey Larson's theories of time, space, and space time. And I want to let you know throughout this document, I'll be referencing it as space time, time, space, but the document itself does not discern between the difference between time, space, and space time, which is kind of sad because that's really what we're working with according to his theories. And it makes a lot of sense. Okay. So that'll be it for hypnosis for today. I think the general summary, as I'd like to do a summary with all of these, is that what they're calling in this declassified document as the left hemisphere and the right hemisphere of the brain, the left being the screening function, the analyzing function, and the right being the, as they put, non-critical, holistic, nonverbal, pattern-oriented component, that these are analogous to what we would say in the modern day, or what is more well known as the conscious mind and the subconscious mind. Okay. So when we think about hypnosis, what we're doing is, as they say here, if the left hemisphere can be distracted either through boredom or through reduction through a semi-sleep state, external stimuli are allowed to pass through unchallenged to the right hemisphere, which you can consider to be the subconscious mind. And how does that happen? We get into the semi-sleep state through lowering our brainwave states. This is a basis of many different teachers' works on lowering a brainwave states to access and reprogram the subconscious mind, such as Dr. Joe, who I massively respect. So, when you can access in the semi sleep state these different features, what you can do is you can induce feelings of happiness in your entire body, feelings of euphoria through what some would say the homunculus would be that portion, but then there's also an emotional portion, which is, as you can see in his the actual declassified documents sketch here, it's there's pleasure controls as well. All right. So I wouldn't worry about too much the left and right hemisphere when it comes to the homunculus, but what we're more getting at with this is that there's this pleasure centers, and this is why through when I did the Exit the Matrix challenge, I did you did a meditation that was called quantum recoding if you did the challenge. And in the quantum recoding meditation, you did this. You lowered your brainwave states, and I gave you suggestions to feel states of bliss, happiness, fulfillment, and to bring in those states because then those states have an effect on your reality, which is something that we'll get into that's not for today's video. So it's just fascinating how in 1983 they knew this to some respect. And I feel like that's pretty much it for this. And when we go into other things like tomorrow, we'll talk about this. We'll talk about transcendental meditation and the Kundalini awakening type things. And there actually is some mind blowing stuff in there. And then the day after, we'll talk about biofeedback and what that means. And biofeedback, to me, when I read it, it wasn't what I thought it was, from my understanding. I thought biofeedback was like biohacking, and it wasn't. It isn't. It isn't at all. To me, in the technology based arena, and it kind of is. They're using music, but again, we'll talk about that later. But if you enjoyed this episode of the Declassified Gateway Experience Explained, consider subscribing so you get the notification when we go live, when we do these next videos, because we got plenty more. There's 38. I did find the missing page, by the way, for those that have been studying this. I'm going to go over the missing page eventually when we get to page 25. All right. And there's some mind blowing stuff in there. So I have that in my possession, and we'll talk about that when we get there. Otherwise, if you're here on YouTube, comment below. If you have experience with the Gateway experience, see what I did there? If you have experience yourself, share it because I'd love to hear what you think or if you've done this because I know a lot of people have done this. Again, I'm not the first person to break this down. So I think it'd be helpful to other people who are new to this to hear from others who have done this before. If you have, if you haven't, just enjoy the breakdown. All right. And I will see you in the next episode. And until then, peace.